Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for attending today. Thank you, CM, for the great and warm introduction. I'm excited to be chatting with all of you about a subject that I am particularly passionate about. Uh, and to understand where that passion comes from, it's helpful to understand just a little bit more about me. Probably the most important thing to know about me is that I am a nerd. If you are wondering what type of nerd, the answer is yes. Like computer, math, sci-fi, Dungeons and Dragons, Star Wars, Star Trek, Starbucks, all of them. But most specifically, I am an engineer. And as an engineer, I have always been obsessed with efficiency ever since I can remember, because really actually before I can remember, because I was born 3 weeks early. So apparently even in my mother's womb, I was like, you know what? I don't need a full 9 months. I'm ready to go right now, right? Let's do this, Mom. Obsessed with efficiency. I went to The Ohio State University, got a degree in computer science and engineering. And after I graduated, I started working at Procter & Gamble as an IT project manager. And if you're not familiar with Procter & Gamble, it's a large consumer goods company, and its philosophy is a promote from within philosophy, which means that their CEO are always people who started at entry-level positions, essentially, in the organization, which also means that if they're going to be successful, they have to do a lot of leadership development. Because if you're going to have your leaders come from within your own ranks, you gotta make sure that you're training them well. In fact, for a number of years, P&G was either the #1 or #2 producer of CEOs of other companies because of that leadership development approach that they take. And for me, I got to see leadership, that effective leadership, really firsthand. I remember a few months being into my job at P&G, we were behind on a project. We're in our status meeting. We started to get pretty kind of like tense with our conversation with each other. We're starting to conflict a little bit, we're starting to butt heads. And my manager kind of quieted everyone down. And he was like, you know what, at the end of the day, we have to remember that we sell soap. And kind of to CM's point around this idea of diffusing tension, it was just kind of this observational moment where we all just started laughing, because we were butting heads as if we were preventing World War III, but rather we were talking about how do we actually, change some IT requirements for something. And it wasn't to discount anything that we were doing. It wasn't to say that it wasn't important. It was simply a way of kind of getting us to step back and look at the situation a little bit differently. And that is something that humor is able to do for us. Also at P&G, that very same manager, I remember my first week on the job, gave me the advice that it is better to beg for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission. Now, in fact, I'm actually curious. So if you agree with that statement, go ahead and put a Y in the chat for yes. If you don't agree with it, go ahead and put a no or an N for no. So that statement again is, it's better to beg for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission. Already seeing some yeses coming in. Definitely yes, right? A lot of people kind of agree with that. They understand the sentiment. They understand that it doesn't mean, okay, like steal and embezzle funds and then just ask for forgiveness later, right? But more about taking risks, about taking chances. And for me, what it did was it gave me ownership of my career. And I will admit, as someone fresh out of college with a little bit of an ego, I was like, you know what? I want to see if my manager actually means that. So I'm going to test him a little bit. And so I started to do things in my role that I thought I would maybe have to beg for forgiveness for. And the big thing that I started to do was I had started doing improv and stand-up comedy in college. So I started to bring some of that into my work. I started to add jokes at the ends of my emails. And I started to teach improv exercises to my teammates. And the thing that I thought for sure I was going to have to beg for forgiveness for was, a year into my career at P&G, I proclaimed myself the corporate humorist of Procter & Gamble. I got business cards made. I started an internal blog. And I kind of assumed that someone would stop me, right? Like someone from HR or legal would come up and be like, hey, you can't just create your own job title. But the reality is that no one ever did. Instead, people started referring to me as the corporate humorist. And they started to invite me to events to be the MC or to speak on the value of humor in the workplace, or they'd have me teach improv exercises. And I realized as I started to do that work more and more, there's tremendous value to using humor at work, because people started to read my emails more. They started to come to my project status meetings. They started to engage with things, and I started to enjoy my work even more. So then I started to explore the research angle, that there's actual business results, business value to using humor in the workplace. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, like I said, I'm excited to be coming to you all virtually, and I'm sure many of you, maybe people have already asked this question, but go ahead and share in the chat where you are zooming in from. You can do that from your physical location if you want, but it's later in the day. You could also do that from your mental location as well if you would like. But go ahead and share where you're zooming in from. London, Suffolk, Paris, love it. A lot of people representing London. I am here in Ohio. I actually live in New York City, but I grew up in Ohio. And so just yesterday, my fiance and I made the drive from New York to Ohio because we're going to see some family while I'm here, while we're also socially distancing. So if you are actually playing one of my favorite Zoom games, which is what's in that person's background? If you're wondering about that about me, I'm doing the same thing because we got to our Airbnb yesterday, still adjusting to this. We've got a nice painting of flowers there. There's this wonderful painting of a cow, which I'm gonna have to ask the Airbnb host about kind of that, but still playing with that in the background. But, you know, I think one of the exciting things about living in this virtual world is that we can have this type of engagement. So again, thank you all for joining, which I know, especially on your all side, for those of you across the pond, it is a little bit later. So what we're going to talk about today is that intersection of humor and leadership, and specifically this idea of leading humans with humor. To frame the conversation, though, it's helpful to understand work a little bit, because it's kind of our belief at Humour That Works, the company that I run, that no matter who you are, what you do, your work comes down to 5 core skills, right? No matter who you are, what you do, your work is a subset of 5 core skills. The first is that you have to be able to execute. You have to be able to complete a task. You have to be able to send an email or schedule a Zoom meeting or shave an alpaca if that's your job, right? Whatever it is, you have to be able to complete tasks. Next, you need to be able to think strategically. You need to be able to solve problems as they come up. You need to figure out why Wi-Fi isn't working, right? You need to be able to solve these types of problems. Next, you need to be able to communicate and to articulate your intelligence in a way that other people understand. You also have to be able to pick the right emoji for the text, especially in a more virtual world. You have to be able to connect, right, at a human level, emotional intelligence, empathy, that kind of thing. And ultimately, you need to be able to lead. You need to be able to influence people to some type of common goal. And so what we're going to focus on today is that top skill of leadership, because leadership, it actually requires those other 4 skills as well. And when it comes to changing your work, when it comes to getting to the next level, it's not always about changing what you do, right? What you do is those 5 core skills, but more about changing how you do it. And I know we've been talking about leadership all day. It's a wonderful summit just on leadership. And I imagine a number of people have different kind of definitions or ideas around what leadership means. For me, I think it's important just to make sure that we're on the same page, at least with what I'm talking about, because unlike many of you, I'm sure, I am a stereotypical American in the sense that I only speak one language. And it took me going to the UK, shout out to the London people, it took me going to the UK to realize that I don't even speak English, right? Because I speak American, because there are differences between British English and American English, right? In the UK, you all say lift. In the US, we say elevator. You all say lorry, we say truck. You all, like when you're out and about, you say toilets or the loo. Here in the US, right? And that's a correct pronunciation of American, just with the asterisk in front. But in the US, instead of toilets or the loo, we say bathroom or restroom. even if you're out in public, right? Even if you're out somewhere, you would say, oh, where's, what about the bathroom, right? Going to the bathroom. And it's like, but there's actually no bath in that room. So it's inaccurate. Or some people say, but we say restroom. And it's like, is that really a room that you want to rest in? I don't think that it is. Like, I like toilets. I like the fact that toilets is way more accurate. I'm an engineer. I like the specificity of it. So I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to start saying that. I'm going to start saying toilets instead because it is more accurate. And then I came back to the States after that trip. I was in New York City where I lived. This was pre-COVID. I was in a Starbucks and I went up to the barista and I was like, excuse me, where are your toilets? And she was confused. She was like, in the bathroom? Right, so I want to make sure that we're on the same page because sometimes we can be using the same word and not actually have the same meaning to that word. And when we're thinking about leadership today, the way that I want to frame it is less about the actual definition of leadership. Instead, what I want you to do is I want you to start thinking about a leader who you admire. Right? This could be someone who you've worked with in the past. It could be one of the speakers or people that you've seen today. It could be someone that's kind of like well-known. Maybe it's a, Steve Jobs or an Oprah Winfrey or whatever it is. But I want you to think of a leader who you admire. And now in the chat, I want you to share with us, what is one thing about that person that makes you admire them as a leader? What is it about their leadership style or their skill that you admire, right? What trait? So go ahead and share any thoughts that you have there in the chat. So James says, they're someone who is inspirational, right? They get people to motivate. Kind of share some of those other thoughts of what they do. They have integrity. They're easy to talk to. They're protective. They're empowering. They're caring, right? The things that you're noting are all actual things that deal with relating with other humans, right? Someone who is kind. You don't have to be kind to a business process. You don't have to be very polite to your computer, like, oh, computer, I hope you start today. I mean, although some of us do talk to our computers like that, but you don't typically have to do that with a machine. But it is something that you have to do with a human, right? So the things that you admire are some of the human traits that they have. You'll also notice that people didn't say, oh, it's because they have that position, right? Because we understand that leadership is not a position. Leadership is not a title. It's not because you've become CEO or because you become managing director, right? Leadership is an attitude, and specifically it's an attitude in action, right? That action piece is really important, that you actually do something to create leadership. Because let me ask you a question. Right? There is a difference between intention and action, right? There's a difference between what you intend to do and your actual actions and how they're perceived. The question is, how do we judge other people by their intention or their action? Go ahead and share that in the chat, type intention or action. How do we judge other people? Their intentions or their actions, right? Their actions, right? Because it's the only thing that we can see. We can't actually know their true intentions all the time, so all we can see is the actions that they take. But here's the interesting part. What do we judge ourselves by? By our intention or our actions, right? What do we judge ourselves by? Share that in the chat. Because it is a little bit different, right? We judge ourselves by our intention. The way that I think about this, like, have you all ever felt good about yourself just because of something that you thought? Let me explain what I mean. For a while, I love desserts. I love sweets. I love milkshakes specifically because they are the most efficient form of dessert. They're amazing. All you have to do is suck, right? It's amazing, most efficient form of desserts. Milkshakes, love them. Also love cookies, love brownies. And as a speaker, I'm constantly on the road. Like pre-COVID, was constantly on the road, constantly speaking at events, constantly like passing by the like dessert cart, etc. And if it was the afternoon and they had set out a plate of cookies, I'd walk by the cookies and think, you know what? I want a cookie. I shouldn't eat it though, because I'm trying to reduce the amount of sugar that I'm eating. So even though I'm a frail person, I still do eat way too much sugar. I was like, I shouldn't eat a cookie. And then I'd feel good about myself. I'd be like, wow, that is good discipline to not eat that cookie. I should reward myself with a cookie. And sometimes we have this thing where we judge ourselves, we feel good about ourselves just because of something that we thought, as opposed to the actions that other people can see. And this gap between intention and action creates something that we call unleadership. And unleaderships are the things that you do that demotivate the people around you that you don't even realize that you're doing. It's things like lying, right? You don't necessarily intend to lie. And this is an interesting, maybe sometimes controversial question, but you can answer this in the chat. If you say you are going to do something and then you do not do it, did you lie? Yes or no? Go ahead and put a Y for yes in the chat if you say you're going to do something and then you do not do it, did you lie? We're getting some people, some say yes, some say no, right? It is a little bit of a controversial question. I would say technically you lied, not intentionally, not maliciously, but to the other person, they see a gap. They see a gap between what you said and what you did. So if you do things like, hey, I'm going to get that to you in an email by Wednesday, and it is Friday, technically you lied. Again, not maliciously, but over time that demotivates the people around you. One of the biggest things that people do that demotivate the people around them is they try to put on a work face. They try to pretend that they are not a human. They try to say, no, I'm the leader, so I've got to always be in control and I can't show any type of emotion and I've got to be this or that or the other. That leads to unleadership because it's not authentic, because it's not real. Because either people are like, oh, they're clearly putting on a facade, or they think, wow, if they've got it together, but I'm feeling stressed out, then there must be something wrong with me. This is a value of authentic leadership. The way that we get around on leadership are through 5 core values of leadership. Now, we're not going to talk about each one today, right? That's not the focus of this talk. Instead, we're talking about humor, which falls under the middle category of vigor, right? Of creating a little bit more resilience and ultimately having a little bit more fun. So now, the question that I want to ask, because people are sometimes like, okay, but what about the studies? Why should I do this? What's the benefit? I want to ask a question. It's a dumb question, but an important question. So I want you to answer this in the chat. And the dumb question is, would you rather do something that is fun or not fun? Right, go ahead and answer that question in the chat. Would you rather do something that is fun or not fun, right? The answer is people are saying fun. Of course, you'd want to do something that is fun. Completely agree. So it stands to reason that if you were to make your work a little bit more fun, are you more likely to be engaged? If you're to make your meetings a little bit more fun, would people be more likely to join them? If you're to make your communication a little bit more fun, do you think people would be more likely to listen? And the answer is yes. I can send you the benefits, right? I can send you the research, case studies, real world examples, the 30 benefits of humor for an individual, the 10 benefits of humor for an organization. We can talk about them in the Q&A if you would like, right? But the reality is, from this simple question, we understand the value of humor. And when you start to see things like this, right? You start to see people, this man is being chased by a dog and he is happy about it, right? Because he's having fun. These construction workers, right? A simple fun thing at a zoo, temporary exhibit, the North American construction worker, just having a little bit of fun. People making a sign, right? A wise doctor once wrote, who knows what that says, right? Someone having a little bit of fun with their chalkboard art. This is a sign for teachers. Kids are our future, not your kids, better ones, right? Just kind of a fun sign for people. This next one is, some people don't necessarily like this one. I think it's very funny. It's a little dark. Veterinarian / taxidermist, either way you get your dog back, right? This is a veterinarian just having a little bit of fun with their work. And the reality is that what gets fun gets done, right? What we do that is fun gets done. Now we're going to start to head into some Q&A. To frame the Q&A, certainly happy to answer questions around overall humor, but also want you to start thinking about what are some of the objections that you have to using humor. What are some of the things that are preventing you as a leader from using it? Because I want to make sure that we can kind of remove those obstacles so that you feel capable of using humor first thing tomorrow when you go into work or that kind of thing. So that's where you can start to think about some of your questions as well. Certainly start to feel free to start to share that. We're going to do some Q&A, some interaction, and then I'll come back at the very end, share just a couple of last thoughts for you. But let me go ahead and switch to that, and we can bring up CM. And yeah, I'd love to answer questions or share thoughts that people have.
Thank you for that, Drew. That was brilliant. I think my initial, and I'll come to some of the comments and the questions. Certainly, what I see and hear people talk about in terms of humor is feeling like they're not going to pull it off, or people are not going to get their not going to get the laughs, or it's going to be misinterpreted. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so there's certainly an aspect to that, right, of how it comes across. So there's an interesting study that was done by the Wharton Business School in conjunction with Harvard, and they wanted to kind of look at both the balance of appropriate humor and successful humor. And so appropriate humor and successful humor, appropriate humor being, did it seem appropriate for the workplace? And successful humor being, did it make someone laugh or not? And in that study, right, so that gives you 4 possible answers, right, that kind of matrix. And they found that if you use successful humor, right, if you had successful humor and it was appropriate, then people thought you were not only more confident, but also more competent, right? Your skill, your ability was improved. If you use appropriate humor, but it was unsuccessful, right, so people didn't laugh, but it was appropriate for the workplace, your competence wasn't affected, but people still saw you as more confident. So even though it wasn't necessarily a successful joke, still people were like, oh, wow, they used humor, so they must be confident in this situation. They found that if you used inappropriate humor and it was successful, you were also still seen as a little bit more confident, but you were seen as less competent, right? You were seen as not having as strong of emotional intelligence because you weren't able to kind of read the room. And then finally, if you used inappropriate humor and it wasn't successful, then there was no kind of, it wasn't necessary, it didn't hurt your confidence, but it also didn't help it as well. And so what that means is that if we can keep our humor positive and inclusive, then if we say something and no one laughs, then it just goes from a positive, inclusive, say, joke into a positive, inclusive statement. And so the appropriateness definitely has a factor into kind of its effectiveness in the workplace.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there are certainly some types of humor that are no longer, we no longer accept, and, you know, just that would damage your reputation in that way. But that's really fascinating, confident and competent. And that's where we all want to be, of course, is feeling confident and competent. And that speaks into, you know, being influential, people listening to you, people rallying behind you as a leader. Someone said to your question of what stops you is fear of causing offense. There's another comment that it might not be to every person's taste, or it might cause offense. So similar point.
Yeah, and using humor as a leader has, you know, it's different than using it as someone out with your friends, and it's different than trying to be a stand-up comedian. Our kind of goal with using humor as a leader is not for people to be like, oh my God, you're so funny, right? And that's there's an important reason why, you know, my company is called Humor That Works and not Comedy That Works, or why this is about leadership and humor, and that is to recognize that humor is more broad than comedy. Right? You can think of humor as certainly including comedy, but it's also something a little bit different or a little bit silly. And the goal is amusement, not necessarily laughter. So it's less about being hilarious and more about being effective. And I think, you know, to the idea of offense and the different styles of humor, psychologist Rod A. Martin defined 4 styles of humor. The first style is affiliative humor. This is positive, inclusive humor. Here in the States, we think of it as kind of like Mr. Rogers or Bob Ross, that type of person where it was just, everything was positive. It was bringing people together. It's team building events. It's kind of like those fun things where there's no target or any humor, right? Positive, inclusive. Affiliative humor, great to use in the workplace. Then there is self-enhancing humor. And self-enhancing humor is humor that you use as a way to enhance your own situations. It's a way to kind of deal with life's hardships in a way. I think of Kurt Vonnegut's quote, laughter and tears are both responses to frustration. I myself prefer to laugh because there's less cleaning up to do afterwards. right? It's about finding those, like, what are those kind of moments? How can I find this difficult situation and find the humor in it? Self-enhancing, positive, focused on yourself. The third style is self-defeating humor. This is a negative form of humor where the target is yourself. This is kind of those kind of like poking fun at yourself type jokes. Things like, when I talk with people, I am a frail person. I was born 8.3 pounds and then stayed that way till I was 15 years old. Right? Or I'll say, growing up skinny, it was always a little bit of a challenge. Like, I know it's tough growing up big, right? But I don't know any fat kids who have ever been thrown, right? I've been used as ammo before, right? So you can kind of make those jokes just kind of poking fun at yourself. So it's a negative form of humor. The target is yourself. And it can be a great form of humor to use for leaders, because what self-defeating humor does, or self-deprecating humor does, is it lowers status differentials. It says, hey, I don't take myself too seriously. I am also a human being, despite what my title or my accomplishments say. We can connect at this human level, right? It creates a little bit of that connection. Good when it is in a high status position. Not so good when it's used in a low status position, and not so good when it's used a lot. So this is one important distinction just between men and women of using humor in the workplace. In one study, they found that when men used humor in the workplace, they were met with a positive response 90% of the time. So positive response being a laugh or a smile or kind of like some type of acknowledgement, like maybe even a head nod. When women used humor in the workplace, they were met with a positive response 20% of the time. Right? That is a huge gap. The same study, though, they looked at the style of humor that people used. 80% of the humor that men used was off the cuff, conversational type humor, building off of whatever was happening in the moment. 70% of the humor that women used was self-defeating, self-deprecating. And so again, one, there absolutely is gender bias in the workplace that we have to work towards fixing. But if because of gender bias, your status is already seen as a little bit lower as, say, a leader, then self-defeating humor may not help. And then the same thing, if it's only self-defeating humor that you use, then eventually people are going to be like, I actually feel bad laughing at that. Like, is this a pity party? Is there self-esteem issues? That kind of stuff, right? So self-defeating, self-deprecating can be great, but used sparingly and in a high status position. And then the fourth style is aggressive humor. This is sarcasm. This is satire. This is, that kind of aggressive style. It's dark humor, etc. And that's not appropriate for the workplace typically. Now, especially with for my fellow UK people on the phone, also are on the line, and also as well as any Australians out there if they're joining, is people are like, but what about banter? What about, like, part of our humor culturally is like taking the piss out of someone. Even saying taking the piss in the US is kind of like, whoa. But in like the UK, it's like, but that's what you do when you meet someone. That's how you get to know someone. That's how you like have fun. And just recognize, because of different cultures, for some people, that quick banter back and forth is about, hey, this is how we get to know each other and build relationships. For other people, that feels, whoa, that's aggressive, right? And so a big piece of how humor comes across is your relationship with someone. Again, as a leader, the normal kind of joke that you think, hey, this is just a little silly banter, a little bit of fun sarcasm. I do it with my friends all the time. I do it with my fellow coworkers, my peers at the same time. As soon as you start to do that with someone who sees your status as higher than them, it might go from fun banter to now you're making fun of them and you're punching down. So I think that can help in terms of making sure that you don't cause offense.
And that's a brilliant explanation. Thank you, Drew. And to that point, someone's posed a question. What about in-jokes that sometimes exclude those that aren't in the know?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of the US Office version of, there's a Michael Scott quote of like, oh my God, I love inside jokes. I'd love to be part of one someday. Right. It's just kind of like that self-deprecating like thing. And so, yeah, that, humor is just a tool, right? And metaphor that I sometimes use is humor is like a screwdriver, right? Because it usually involves some type of little bit of a twist, right? And then also you can use a screwdriver to build things up. You can use a screwdriver to take things down, tear things down. You could also technically use a screwdriver to like stab someone if you wanted to. So it's just a tool. And recognizing that humor can be great for bringing people together, or it can help to divide. It can create in-group versus out-group. And so the way to try to avoid that is, well, it doesn't mean don't create inside jokes, right? That's part of how people feel part of the community. But as a leader, bring other people in with you. if there is an inside joke, be like, hey, just a little bit of context to this thing why we're laughing about this is because this thing that happened in the past, right? And this is here. And then now they can be brought into the inside joke as part of it, rather than like, oh, we're all going to laugh. And then someone's like, what's so funny? You're like, you wouldn't get it, right? No, like bring them in as part of the journey.
I have a question also. We'll see how this lands. Do you think that as an American, you are as funny as an Irish person? She's asking for a friend.
Asking for a friend, of course. I think, I mean, one of the funniest people I know.
She is.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
One of the funniest people that I know is Irish. I don't know. It's interesting because I think I'm hilarious, and I don't know if that is a good thing to like. I don't know if you're supposed to say that, but this is part of actually one of the reasons why I started using humor in the workplace was just so that I would have more fun myself. And I crack up at my own jokes when people ask me like, what's your favorite joke? I usually go to one that I have written, like, and I don't know if that's weird, but it's like, that's what I know pretty well. And there is, you know, my TEDx talk on the skill of humor has over 7 million views and is disproportionately more likes than dislikes. So it's like, I think I can look, the engineers in me is like, I can numerically say that I am funny to some people. I've won comedy competitions and things like that. So as a whole, I don't know. I would say as an American, I do believe that I am funny, but actually I don't know if I'm as funny as my funny Irish friend that I know. This guy, his name is David Nihill. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. When he started doing stand-up comedy, he started doing stand-up in the US, but he wanted to get on bigger stages. And so he told comedy club owners, he's like, oh, I'm a famous comedian in Ireland called Irish Dave. And they're like, oh, that's cool. And so like, we should book him and all. So he started doing these bigger shows right away. And he's like, never once did they question the thought that someone in Ireland would have the name Irish Dave in Ireland. He's like, oh, okay, yeah, of course. Yeah, they would call themselves, that'd be like, I'm American Drew doing only US shows. But he's a very, very funny person. So shout out to them as well.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Just let me check how we're doing here. we're doing good. Someone said, I love the fun is done bit, but to use humor and avoid offending takes discipline and self-control, right? Maybe speak into that piece of it, of, you know, what happens to us when we think we've got a line to deliver.
Yeah, well, so absolutely. I think the way that I think about humor is, to go back kind of even to the appropriate piece is humor is a way for me to get results with the hardest thing I've ever had to work with, which is humans, right? Especially other humans, but even myself. And so when we train on humor in the workplace, it's less about, hey, just have fun and add jokes, but more around using humor for a specific purpose, right? So rather than just like, I'm going to use humor so that people think that I'm funny, more of like, okay, I want to use humor in this. I want to start this meeting with the story so that people are listening and leaning in. And then now I have their attention. Or I'm going to use humor in this email so that people actually click on it. Or I'm going to use humor in our newsletter so that people continually open it each week because they know it's going to be something fun. And so the way that we frame that is what's called a humor map, which stands for your medium, your audience, and your purpose. So your medium being, what medium is it going to be in? Is it going to be an email? Is it a one-on-one conversation? Is it a Zoom call? Is it a Zoom meeting versus a Zoom webinar? Like those all have distinctions of what you might do. The next is your audience. Who is going to receive that humor? Like we talked about the relationship that you have with the person. And also, what does that person need? What does that person expect? And then you can deliver against what they need in a way that they don't quite expect, right? That's where the humor comes in, a little bit of that twist. You still need to know what they need, right? Because if your manager comes to you and to borrow from Office Space, at least the American comedy, if your boss comes to you and is like, hey, do you have those GPS reports? You can't just like make a joke and then be like, no, seriously, do you have those reports? You can't be like, all right, well, see you later, right? You like still have to actually do your work. You still have to be good at what you do. You still have to deliver results. It's just changing how you do it. So understanding that audience, delivering against what they need in a way they don't quite expect. And then finally, the most important one is your purpose. Why are you using humor? Are you using it for any number? Are you using it to build rapport with people? Because that's a different type of humor that you might use than if you're trying to explain something that people remember later and actually improve their understanding. So when you start to work with that map, that helps to prevent any thought of like, oh, well, this person is just trying to be funny, or now I'm going to cause offense, because it gives you a more specific goal. And when people first start out, the map can feel a little bit like, but I just want it to be more free flowing and fun. But it's like any skill that you learn, it's a little bit more conscious at the beginning. And then as you get used to it, it's something that you start to naturally do.
And you've actually done quite a lot of research on that. I think on your website, you've got a really long list of research about all the different elements of humor and how that works and or doesn't work. There's a question about what about humor from cultural references that different generations don't get. He or she says, I was talking about the spinal tap this week and the younger generations didn't get it. Turn it up to 11.
Yeah, turn it up to 11. Love it. This is spinal tap. There's an interesting, I think it's an XKCD comic. I'm a big fan of XKCD. It's very much within that nerdy wheelhouse. And if people can find it on Google or whatever, the XKCD comic is the Lucky 10,000. And it's this idea that sometimes when we say something to people and they don't know it, we're like, what? How could you possibly not know spinal tap? It's one of the best things. That's ridiculous. You do it. Instead of that approach, thinking of it as, oh, this is so exciting. You're one of the 10,000 people today around the world that get to learn this new thing that I get to share with you. And so I think for inside jokes, if people don't like, if you make it, one, don't necessarily make it, if you don't know if the audience knows it or not, and there's a chance that they won't, don't necessarily make a huge, an entire long keynote like kind of reference. But if it's a quick reference and it's like, turn it up to 11 and people are like, I don't get that. And be like, oh my God, you're so fortunate. You've got to watch This is Spinal Tap. Here, let me send you a clip around that particular thing. What's great about that, and this is part of the reason why humor is so great in networking, is if you seed ideas like that, now you have a perfect excuse to follow up with people. And the follow-up isn't, hey, buy my service, or, you know, hey, here, do this work that you have to do. The follow-up is something fun. It's like, hey, I mentioned turn it up to 11. Some people didn't know. So here's a quick link to that on YouTube. Go and check it out. You're really going to enjoy it. And now you're providing a gift to people because you're giving them the gift of laughter. And it's a great thing to follow. So I think when people don't necessarily get it, use it as a chance to be like, yes, now I get to introduce you to something fun.
Well, and I think it builds the trust level as well, because you didn't make them feel stupid.
Exactly.
In the moment, unlike my children who go, Mum, you don't get our humor. So there we go. What else have we got here? Different people, different appreciations of humor in the workplace. We've answered that one. Is self-defeating the same as self-deprecating?
Yes and no, kind of. So if you talk to psychologist Rod A. Martin, who defined the 4 styles, he would say that they are slightly different. For me, for our intents and purposes, I think that they're pretty similar. Self-defeating, from a more psychological term, comes from more of a place out of doing it out of low self-esteem. And it can be a little bit more negative, where self-defeating or self-deprecating humor can still come from a positive place. I kind of bring the two together. If you want to be more accurate about it, then self-defeating humor, typically bad. Self-deprecating humor can be good if in a high status position, if you want to kind of like be specific about those words. I did also see a quick comment in there that's maybe kind of related to that around coping strategy and things like that. Is absolutely, there is a great mental benefit to humor. There's also a pure physiological benefit to humor in the workplace as well. A lot of times we think of humor or we think of stress as a bad thing, but the reality is, like, stress by itself is not bad, right? Stress is how we grow. If we are working out our muscles, we're breaking down our muscles so that we can get them stronger later. But we need that rest and fuel in order to grow stronger muscles. Stress is the same way. Stress helps us to then figure out, okay, we become more efficient. This is why productivity continues to increase over years and years and years, because we have additional stress and we're like, okay, how do we solve this? We get more efficient in our process, more effective. The problem is when we have chronic stress. It's when we don't relieve that stress that we see an increase in blood pressure, an increase in muscle tension, a decrease in the immune system, yada, 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 right? The negative physiological effects of stress. Humor counteracts that impact, right? When we laugh, we increase the flow of oxygen in our bodies. We decrease the muscle tension. We increase our immune system, right? So there is benefit to even just throughout your day finding ways to laugh, even if it's just to take a break, something that we call strategic disengagement, just as a way to disengage a little bit so that you don't have burnout. And then when you come back into things, you're more energized, more recharged. And so I think there's also that, you know, not just the mental and the like logic and all that kind of stuff, but there is physiological benefits to it.
For sure. And yes, when teams are under pressure, it can take the silliest common experience that they've had, right? Someone commenting on it that kicks everyone off. Then and potentially again later, right? When they reference it, it becomes the in joke. So long as we explain that. We have a few minutes left. Drew, do you want to wrap up the session for us?
Yeah, I would love to close on an idea, and I'll show. Let me share
and also
these.
your website is humorthatworks.com. Is that correct?
That is correct. And if you put the British spelling, you will be redirected to the American spelling of that word. But either way that you get to humorthatworks.com, it is there. And yeah, we have plenty of resources there. As CM mentioned, we've got links to different studies on it if you want the actual research on it. We've got plenty of free blog posts about kind of using humor. We got a link to our book, which explains kind of the what, why, and how of humor in the workplace. We have information about, we're doing free kind of improv drop-ins and open mics on the weekends for people. We have virtual and in-person workshops, in the future in-person workshops, and past in-person workshops. So you can find out all that information on humorthatworks.com. But the thing that I want to kind of close on is understanding why some people don't use humor in the workplace. And the number one reason, at least in the study that we did, for why people don't use humor is they said that they didn't think that their boss or coworkers would approve, right? Which means that if your team, if your group, if your organization isn't having fun, isn't bringing smiles, isn't having people come together and laugh, you're probably part of the reason why. And I don't necessarily mean it doesn't mean that you necessarily have squashed out humor, but you maybe haven't done some things to start to support it. And again, it's probably not an intentional thing. It's probably not something that you're like, I definitely don't want people to have fun, but it's more about the actions that you take. So one of the things you can do is, of course, you can encourage more humor by rewarding it, right? So you can create top banana of the month type award if you would like. You can we help some organizations create their humor awards as part of their normal kind of ongoing recognition program, but you can also simply just laugh a little bit more. So this is my mom, picture of my mom. You can smile a little bit more. This is my nephew, Theo, right? Because a laugh and a smile costs you nothing, right? If someone says something in the workplace, and it's not the funniest thing in the world, but if you just smile, right? It's not like it's going to prevent you from laughing or smiling later, right? You laugh at a bad joke. It's not like you're going to watch Netflix a little bit later or be watching something on the BBC and then not be able to laugh, right? It's not like you're going to be physically unable to. It costs you nothing. And those you can make laugh are those you can lead. So I'd encourage you to start to find ways to incorporate humor into your own work. Certainly, we've talked about some different styles there. Hopefully, you've also seen it demonstrated as well, right? Part of the reason the way that I present the way that I do is so that you can get some ideas of things you can do yourself. Oh, maybe I can incorporate more images. Maybe I can have some more kind of fun play on words. Maybe I can start with the story, right? Whatever it is, hopefully from the demo from it. The thing that I'll encourage you to do, my call to action for you is to simply start to think about 1 smile per hour, right? Try to drive 1 smile per hour. And that's not necessarily smiling once per hour for yourself, but for some people that might be a start. But it's simply to think of what's one thing that you can do each hour of the day that brings a smile to your face or the face of someone else. So if you're like, I'm getting ready to go into an hour-long Zoom meeting, what's one thing that I can do to make people smile? If it's like, oh, I'm getting ready to go on my commute, what's one thing that you can do to make yourself smile? If it's, oh, I'm getting ready to go and have dinner with my family, what's one thing that I can do with my family during dinner that brings a smile on the face? That starts to develop a humor habit. You start to see the opportunities for humor all around the world in front of you. You don't necessarily have to do anything big or grandiose. And you then start to choose humor. Because the reality is you decide every single day how you're going to do your work. So why not choose to be more productive, less stressed, and happier? Why not choose to get better results and have more fun? Why not choose humor that works? Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you all so much for having me.